Violence in Syria and Egypt continues, threatening religious minorities. Congressman Chris Smith explains. And a controversial abortion bill is close to passage in Ireland. In a rare interview, we'll speak with the Papal Nuncio there, Archbishop Charles Brown. Plus, why are these nuns topping the music charts? Their producer, Monica Fitzgibbons of de Montfort Music, is here to explain. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. The human rights situation in Egypt is deteriorating, particularly for Christians. And what of the Chinese human rights advocate Chen Guangcheng, who just left NYU? We'll talk to one of the people responsible for his release and his domicile here in the United States, Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey. And later, Ireland is on the verge of legalizing abortion as the church continues to recover from its own sex abuse crisis. In an exclusive interview, the Papal Nuncio to Ireland, Archbishop Charles Brown, discusses all of it. And finally, some good news. A little recording project by a small order of nuns, the Benedictines of Mary, has been setting the Billboard classical charts ablaze. Here to tell us about it is their producer and co-founder of de Montfort Music, Monica Fitzgibbons. And as always, we want you to be part of the program. The number 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. and internationally 205-271-2980. Or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. Now, here's the brief news from the world over this week. In spite of the ouster of Islamist-backed Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi, the troubles continue for Christians there. Emerging sectarian violence in northern Sinai appears to have claimed the lives of 2 Christians. Security officials say suspected militants killed a merchant who was abducted over the weekend. 60-year-old Magdi Habashi's decapitated body was found in a cemetery on Thursday. And a Coptic priest, Father Mina Aboed Sharobin, was gunned down on Saturday as he walked in an outdoor market. Christians have become the target of Islamist militants since Morsi's removal. Many Christians, including leaders of both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, were among those who spoke out against the Morsi regime and urged his resignation. In the past week, at least 100 have been killed in sectarian clashes between Morsi supporters and opponents, as well as in military crackdowns against protests. Meanwhile, Christian leaders are objecting to Egypt's newly formed constitution. They claim it's more Islamist than the one that was suspended last week. Egypt's 2012 constitution, adopted by referendum, declared that the principles of Sharia be the, quote, main source of legislation. According to the Fides news agency, the amended constitution, which Egypt's new government states is provisional, adds that the interpretation of the Sharia should be in accordance with the body of laws developed in the early centuries of Islam. Moreover, a section of the 2012 Constitution, which discusses the rights of Christians and Jews, has been eliminated. A Coptic Catholic bishop said the new constitution ridicules Egypt's Christian minority and that the faithful must speak up now before it's too late. And the long-expected Wednesday vote to legalize abortion in Ireland has been delayed. Prime Minister Enda Kenny ceded to opponents' demand that 165 amendments be debated and considered. After an all-night session, Ireland's lower house only considered 10 of the amendments before adjourning. Kenny, whose government opposes all 165 amendments, said debate will continue until Friday, but does not want the vote to drag on until the end of July. Debate can be suspended at any time. The legislation would permit an abortion at any moment during a pregnancy if deemed necessary to save the life of a mother, and that would include suffering from suicidal tendencies. And Texas' highly contentious abortion legislation cleared a special session of the State House on Wednesday. The bill, which includes a ban on abortions at 20 weeks of gestation, is expected to be passed by the state Senate and signed by Republican Governor Rick Perry. 2 weeks ago, the measure was stopped in the waning hours of Texas's regular legislative session. A 13-hour filibuster and an unruly pro-abortion gallery drew national attention, preventing the Republican-controlled Senate from completing its vote before the legislative session expired. And the United States' largest association of Catholic hospitals has again broken with the country's bishops, this time to support the Obama administration's final regulation mandating that employers with 50 employees provide contraceptive coverage in their health care plans. The Catholic Health Association, which defied the bishops and supported President Obama's health care overhaul, told its members that the latest Department of Health and Human Services rule resolved its concerns. CHA pronounced that the government accommodation will not require its members to contract, provide, pay, or refer for contraceptive coverage. That opinion contradicts what the bishops are saying. The USCCB claims that the problems with the religious employer exemption and the problems with the lack of any exemption or accommodation for individuals or for-profit businesses are an enduring problem. More than 100 lawsuits against the contraceptive mandate are pending. And Thursday, Pope Francis overhauled the Vatican City-State's criminal code. Among the changes, the Pope has criminalized the leaking of Vatican information, financial wrongdoing, and crimes against children, including sexual violence, prostitution, and possession of child pornography. The laws apply to clergy and lay people who live and work in Vatican City. Many of the new provisions brought the city-state up to date with international treaties and financial norms, some new to the Vatican Penal Code as a response to last year's VatiLeaks scandal. And on Monday, Pope Francis urged solidarity with immigrants during his first trip outside of Rome to the small Italian island of Lampedusa. He mourned the death of African migrants who recently perished at sea, trying to reach a better way of life in Europe. During his Mass homily, the Holy Father spoke of the failure of Christians to recognize refugees and migrants as their brothers and sisters. He said, "We are no longer attentive to the world in which we live. Those in need are seen no longer as a brother and sister to be loved, but simply another person who disturbs our lives and our comfort." Decrying what he called the culture of comfort, he said migrants routinely fail to find understanding, fail to find acceptance, fail to find solidarity. And the Holy Father has extended Pope Benedict XVI's welcome to disaffected Anglicans and others to the personal ordinariates, free-floating dioceses created for them in recent years. In an important change to the norms that govern these ordinariates, a baptized Catholic who is not yet confirmed and subsequently returns to the practice of the faith as a result of the evangelizing mission of an ordinariate may be admitted to that ordinariate. As reported by the Telegraph's Damian Thompson, previously only former Anglicans and their families could be received into an ordinariate. The personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham in Great Britain released a statement saying the modification by Pope Francis makes clear the contribution of the personal ordinariates in the work of the new evangelization and confirms the ordinariate's wider mission in the Catholic Church. Well, it was a week of high praise and honors for Pope Francis from some unlikely sources. Vanity, not Vatican, but it sounds like Vatican Fair, Vanity Fair Italia named Pope Francis Man of the Year, and it's only July. In its cover story that hit newsstands on Wednesday, the high-end pop culture magazine declared that the Pope's first 100 days have already placed him in the category of world leaders who make history. Among the Pope's fans, quoted in the piece, past critic of the Church, Elton John. He said Francis is a miracle of humanity in an era of vanity. Humility, rather, not humanity, but humility in an era of vanity. Much of the article echoed that sentiment, pointing to the Pope's simple living and outwardly expressed compassion for the disadvantaged. Esquire also ran a story entitled, "It's Time to Admit Pope Francis is Kind of Awesome." Meanwhile, in South America, a couple of statues of Pope Francis were unveiled this week, and he didn't think they were awesome at all. In Buenos Aires, where Cardinal Bergoglio served as Archbishop, a life-sized, flesh-toned likeness of the Pope was erected in his honor in front of the cathedral. Pope Francis apparently didn't care much for the display. According to reports, once he got word of it, he personally called the Buenos Aires Chancery and requested that it be removed immediately. I can understand why. The likeness is not exactly flattering. Alas, there's an apparent copy being dragged through the streets of Rio ahead of World Youth Day. This is one papal gift that we can pretty much assume will not be returning home with the Pope after he visits Brazil. When we return, Congressman Chris Smith joins us to talk about the plight of religious minorities in Syria and Egypt and much more. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. He is a senior member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, here to talk about the suffering of religious minorities in Egypt and Syria and the controversy surrounding Chinese dissident Chen Guangcheng. Is a World Over regular. Representative Chris Smith, thank you for being here. Pleasure to have you back. Let's start with Egypt, and then I want to work to Chen and so many other things to talk with you about this week. In Egypt, we're seeing Christians attacked whole villages in this Naga Hassan area. You've got houses being destroyed, men being dragged out, the women beaten. I mean, priests being killed, 4 people butchered by machete in this village. What is happening to this minority, and why isn't the United States and John Kerry in the State Department more engaged?
Why isn't President Obama speaking out? You know, he gave his infamous speech in Cairo, and there's been little or no follow-up to that speech. But that said, I had a hearing, 3 of them, in the last Congress on the Coptic Christians and their mistreatment, especially the buying and selling and the forced marriages of Coptic Christian girls to Islamic men, and they call it Islamicizing the womb, because from then on that girl or that young woman has no choice but to stay in that marriage. A terrible human rights abuse, and I've yet to be able to get this administration 3 hearings to focus on it. The Coptic Christians under Mubarak had a tough road to hoe.
Yeah, I mean, they were being kind of bullied around, but we weren't having them butchered.
Not even close to this. As a matter of fact, they had a man in the cabinet of Mubarak, Boutros Ghali was his name.
Right.
I would meet with him all the time, as well as Mubarak, and there would be action taken when there were instances of hate and attacks on Coptic Christians, about 10% of the Egyptian population. But there was a sea change when Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood came in, and now that Morsi is out, there is scapegoating of the Coptic Christians. There's killings, there's murders going on.
Churches being looted.
Churches being looted. Remember, they were being burnt for months. And that's when Morsi was in power with almost no enforcement of any kind of rule of law or police action to protect the Christians.
Congressman, there are $1.5 billion that the United States grants in aid to Egypt. That was supposed to be contingent on a constitution and a government that moved toward democracy. The previous Secretary of State waived it. John Kerry has followed Hillary Clinton's lead. He's also waived that provision. Why? And can you all do anything in the House of Representatives?
Well, obviously it takes the House and the Senate, and it was very hard to get the religious freedom conditionality into the Foreign Ops Appropriations Bill. 3 of us worked on it very hard.
Which says what?
Which says that if religious minorities are not treated with respect, monies will not flow to Egypt. Hillary Clinton waived it. and simply said, oh, this provision, we'll just set that aside and send the money anyway. Because we have seen this coming. Yeah. You know, there's been a crescendo of hate directed towards the Coptic Christians and others, but especially them. And we have just fiddled and looked askance. And again, I'm going to do another hearing on Egypt and in about 2 weeks, focusing on the Coptic Christians. And I will be asking tough questions, if they show up, of the administration. Yeah. What are they doing with the military? What are they doing with the interim government to ensure that they are protected? We have been without a voice.
Let's talk about Syria for a moment. This is a terrible situation. The largest concentration of Christians outside of Egypt, which is dwindling by the moment. Syria is under intense persecution. We have 2 Orthodox bishops who've been kidnapped.
And we don't know where they are.
No, they're murders all the time. This is ongoing. I could run through the list. 27-year-old Father Michael Kyle of the Armenian Catholic Church was abducted. Greek priest Mahfuz kidnapped. A Syrian Orthodox priest kidnapped. A mutilated corpse of Father Haddad. I mean, it goes on and on and on. What can be done here in Syria? And why is there talk? Why are we arming these rebels?
The Free Syrian Army? It's a great question. Because we don't know who they are. There's been inadequate vetting as to what their affiliations are, where they would take Syria should Assad be toppled. But I had a hearing in late June because I was so frustrated with the lack of response on the part of the Obama administration towards the Christians, about 10%, like Egypt, of the population of Syria. And the administration witness over and over again said, let me take that question back. Let me look into that. There's no plan. There's no sense of prioritization. There's no sense of urgency. And many of the Christians are being put to flight. You know, 2/3 of the Christians in Iraq have been put to flight. Many others have been murdered, and that's with U.S. troops on the ground.
And the Bush administration wasn't particularly receptive to these cries.
They could have done a lot more. I saw that when I was in Baghdad. We could have done a lot more to help the Christian minorities there, and some of them are go right back to Christ. I mean, that's how ancient these are.
These are the cradle of Christianity in the world.
But in Syria, you know, one of the things that the takeaway from the hearing was that the Christians aren't caught in the middle. They are being targeted. They're not collateral damage between the Sunni and the Shia in that war that's going on there. They are being targeted precisely because they're Christians, with beheadings, with murders, and many have been, you know, have as best they can tried to leave the country.
Is this a religious purging?
Oh, I called it a genocide. You know, the definition under the UN Treaty on Genocide is the elimination, even the threat of elimination, in whole or in part, of a group based on religion, ethnicity, and it goes through a list. When you're targeting the Christians, as we see in Syria now, that is genocide. The UN, the United States, ought to be taking the lead in branding this a genocide. And, you know, let me just say, when it happened to the Muslims in Srebrenica during the Serbian war there in Bosnia and Republic of Srpska, I only not held hearings, but was a voice continually saying, when any group is targeted, Muslim, Christian, anyone, Jews, we've got to be outspoken in their defense. The Obama administration has been asleep at the switch.
I want to shift gears, talk about Chen Guangcheng, the Chinese dissident. You were very instrumental, and in that dramatic hearing where they held the telephone up and he made his plea to come to the United States. That was really the tipping point. I know you were involved in a lot of those negotiations to get him out of China. He came here, he was at my alma mater at NYU, and the year that they committed to him ended. There are claims, he claimed, I know you and others have claimed, that he was under pressure there. He couldn't say things or was being pressured not to say things against the Chinese government. Was that the case?
Well, Chen himself has said, Chen Guangcheng, that he was continually admonished, told, directed in a way that made it very hard for him to speak out boldly and effectively. One of the things that I have done in the past when I've worked on dissidents, name the country, but especially from China, Wei Jingsheng, Harry Wu, great dissidents, is to have them come before the Human Rights Committee that I chair and tell their story. Well, Chen wanted to do it, and there was a great deal of pressure for him not to do it. He finally did it later on. There was a New York Times story in today that was full of
it was a cover
misinformation
story on the New York Times.
Because it said that the hearing never occurred. It occurred a couple of months ago. And Chen spoke. He was the only witness and was absolutely magnificent in his defense of human rights for all of the Chinese people, the women who were being forcibly aborted, because that's what got him in trouble in the first place, and also on behalf of his nephew, who is now in his place being tortured. And where has been the administration's response on Chen's nephew? President Obama met with President Xi Jinping at that famous summit on the West Coast. I had a hearing a couple of days before that on the eve of the Tiananmen Square massacre, remembering that brutality, but made a strong appeal to the president to raise Chen's nephew. As far as we can tell, nothing of the kind occurred. And
so what becomes of him now? The New York, if you read the New York Times, it says, look, this was a guy who, you had all these extremists, religious extremists and pro-life activists that wanted to recruit him to their cause, and he was advised by NYU, stay away from these people, they'll only marginalize you.
Well, we saw that right from the beginning. Even when he came into Newark Airport, we had a whole group waiting for him at Newark Airport to welcome him out of sheer joy and happiness that this great human rights defender and his wife, who was equally brave, finally had found freedom. You know, the administration gave Chen Guangcheng back to the secret police. Even though he went to a hospital, he was surrounded by police. And one of the lawyers that I actually had at one of my hearings a couple of years before that, who went back to China, on his way to visit with Chen, was beaten to a pulp. I mean, he had a very, very clouded future, and I think it was a matter of when and not if that he would be back in prison or suffer, you know, an accident which could take his life. He said at that hearing you talked about, I want to come to America, and a couple of hours later,
and what will become of him now?
Well, the Witherspoon Institute, among one other, and it looks like the other one may not come to fruition. We don't know where. He is being put out on the street by NYU, and that's the only way I could put it. You don't treat a world-class human rights defender, a man who has suffered so much on behalf of human rights, with this, you know, on a date certain you get out of here. And more of this will come out as to how mistreated he really has been. But the Witherspoon Institute has offered him, Robbie George and some of the people up in Princeton, an excellent opportunity to work on human rights, to continue his education, and with a very good salary. And I do hope he takes it, or perhaps even Fordham.
Let's talk about this Texas ban on abortion that passed this week, a 20-week ban. How similar is this to what's been happening in the House of Representatives, what we hear Marco Rubio is considering presenting in the Senate?
Well, Trent Franks was the prime sponsor, one of our pro-life champions in the House of Representatives, of a very comprehensive bill that would, we know now, that children, at least at 20 weeks after fertilization, are pain capable. They can feel pain. We didn't know that 20 years ago. We began learning about it 10 or 15 years ago. And even when microsurgeries and in utero benign interventions are done, particularly when there's an actual surgical operation, the child in the womb gets anesthesia because they feel it. Well, we know that abortions are very painful to the unborn child from at least the 20th week on, and maybe even before that. So that is what the language in both Texas and the U.S. House of Representatives bill says, that those pain-capable children will be protected, except in a very, very limited circumstance. A few more circumstances in the Texas statute than the House bill, but it's a very comprehensive bill. And there are other great things in the Texas bill, including ensuring that the abortion clinics after Gosnell,
they have to meet certain.
They have to be like an ambulatory service, so that there's
so the standards in place.
So if a woman
these women are not being going to.
That's
these,
right. We've had a woman die
literally
recently in Maryland. We've had women die. You know, over 400 women have died from legal abortion, and it's probably a gross under number and estimation since Roe versus Wade from legal abortion.
The opponents say to you that these bills, these bans are constitutionally dubious. You've seen holdups or delays in Arizona, Georgia, Idaho. What makes you think these are going to stand?
Well, every bill we've ever done, and I've done several myself, Henry Hyde's legislation on no Medicaid funding for abortion, all were litigated by abortion groups. Even the language out of that Stephen Friend and Joe Pitts authored in Pennsylvania. And Governor Casey was the governor who defended it, went to the Supreme Court in the famous Casey case. Planned Parenthood brought that suit of southwestern Pennsylvania, which had informed consent, the whole idea of a woman's right to know, and other regulatory data in there. Well, Gosnell didn't follow any of that, and we saw where that led to. Yeah. Not only dead babies that were stored in jars in the refrigerator, very late-term abortions as well, but also women who died. Yeah. And so we expect all of this to be litigated. The partial birth abortion ban was turned down by the High Court. We sent them another bill, and eventually it was sustained by the Supreme Court. The Court, frankly, has too much to say. Yeah. It did so in Roe versus Wade itself when it nullified 2 state statutes in Georgia and in Texas. And every other state saw its pro-life laws evaporate because of Supreme Court.
Very quick question. I know we're almost out of time. Sure. This immigration bill has passed through the Senate. It's now at the House. It appears, if Speaker Boehner is to be believed, what he said the other day, they're not going to take up that Senate bill but do this piecemeal. Is that a good idea? And what does that mean? Will elements of the Senate bill be preserved, or? Well,
the Senate bill is very thick. And be careful when people talk about comprehensive bills. We saw that with Obamacare. Yep. We saw it with the stimulus package. We see it. And when these very large, written behind closed door types of pieces of legislation get done, very often they have not been vetted. What the House Republicans are doing, and I think very effectively, is looking at bills that will really target a number of things, including, you know, I voted for the 1986 legislation that provided the ability for people to stay here, but also for enforcement of employer sanctions. So the magnet goes away, because, you know, we are a nation that cherishes the rule of law.
Did it work?
It didn't work because the employer sanctions part was never implemented.
Never enforced.
And that includes by Republican and Democrat administrations. We now have things like E-Verify that make it very easy, and there's a bill that's making its way through the House that will ensure that when you or I or anyone goes before an employer, you say, this is who I am. It can be verified almost instantaneously, and that's the way to go.
Okay, we'll keep watching.
Thank you, Raymond.
Congressman Smith, thank you so much. And when we return, the church in Ireland has been going through a rough patch, but there's reasons for hope. Papal Nuncio to Ireland, Archbishop Charles Browne, will give us an update in an exclusive interview when The World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. The church in Ireland once exported clergy all over the globe. Today, Ireland's legislature is considering legalizing abortion. The sex abuse crisis has shaken the faith of many Irish faithful, and there's a priestly vocation crisis. Despite the difficulties, my next guest sees a great deal of hope. He began his career as a parish priest in the Archdiocese of New York, and from 1994 to 2011, he worked at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome under Pope Benedict. The Pope Emeritus named him Papal Nuncio to Ireland in 2011. He sat down with me recently in Dublin to offer his insights on the many challenges facing the country and the hope he sees all around. Here's my exclusive interview with Archbishop Charles Browne. Now, from 1994 to 2012, you were in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. It's where we first met.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you ever expect, coming from this background, really as a theologian, that you'd find yourself as a diplomat in Ireland?
Never in my wildest dreams. No, absolutely, Raymond. It came as a huge surprise to me in the fall of 2011 when the Secretary of Cardinal Bertone, the Secretary of State, called me and asked me to come and see the Cardinal to speak about something. And until I walked in, until probably 20 minutes into the discussion, I had no idea what it was about.
Gosh. How did working in that office with then Cardinal Ratzinger for so many years prepare you for this position?
I can thank the Lord for giving me the opportunity to work for Cardinal Ratzinger for so many reasons. Just to be with someone who was so smart, so intelligent, but also someone who really loved the truth and would seek the truth at all costs. He was someone who would always try to arrive at what was true, even when that costed quite a bit. And that was a great message for me.
You also were in the position of looking at the entirety of the world, the church around the world, from your post. Sure. And not only the doctrinal issues that you were wrestling with every day, but the practical implications of those. How has that helped you in this new vineyard, to take Benedict's line?
Yeah, absolutely. I, of course, was ordained for the Archdiocese of New York, served very happily there in a parish in the Bronx before I went to Rome in the early 1990s. But the great thing about working in the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith is to get that universal vision of the Church, to see how the Church is flourishing in certain areas and perhaps under threat in others, to see how the single truth of Christ is expressed in different ways in the liturgical and historical traditions of different areas of the Catholic Church. So it gives you a real universality of vision. And that, I think, was one of the great gifts of working there for all those years.
Now, what does the priest from New York bring to Ireland?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is that I have some kind of cultural affinity with Irish people, because I'm not 100% Irish American myself.
Oh, okay.
But my mother's maiden name was Patricia Murphy, and that
so that got you over the border.
Okay, get much more Irish than that. Although even she is not 100% Irish.
Don't tell them.
No, we'll keep that. We'll keep that secret. But of my 8 great-grandparents, 5 came from this island. And I often say when I'm here, I would I would not be a Catholic today were it not for the faith of this island. And so for me, that's one of the, in a sense, the benefits that I've received from Ireland and coming to Ireland as the nuncio. I think it's helped me in a certain way to connect with people, because I share the cultural background of Ireland.
As I travel about this island, it's not my first time here, but I recently took my 2 boys on this trip. And it's been amazing visiting these Catholic shrines, the ruins, St. Kevin, back in the, I mean, we're talking the early antiquity here, where the gospel was here and alive. And yet, what has happened in the intervening years, particularly the last few decades in your estimation, and what needs repair?
You know, first thing to think about with Ireland is the antiquity of the faith on this island, that there were Christians, there have been Christians, Catholics on this island for 15 centuries, for 1,500 years, that St. Patrick was evangelizing Ireland well over 100 years or even more before St. Augustine of Canterbury arrived in England. Of course, there was Catholic faith in England before St. Augustine, but the history of the Church in Ireland goes back to the real origins of our faith. And what's interesting about the early Church in Ireland was the deep monastic tradition, that it was a monastic church. It had interesting connections to the Church of Egypt, the Desert Fathers. And here in Ireland, during the first centuries, there were indeed Desert Fathers and mothers, you know, men and women, ascetics, who went out into the wild wilderness of Western Ireland to live a life of miracle working, of grace, of divinization, which created a kind of spiritual aura in this island. Then, of course, you move into the Middle Ages, in which the church is flourishing in Ireland, and then, of course, into the Reformation. Ireland is then under the control of the English, and we enter into a period of great persecution of the Catholic faith in Ireland. So Ireland, which was the land of saints and scholars, also then becomes the land of the martyrs. And that's really the tradition that brings us into the modern era, which is really characterized first by this incredible missionary flourishing in the last 100 years, and brings us into the present moment, which is a moment of difficulty and challenge, and indeed in some cases crisis. But we have behind us 1,500 years of lived faith and sanctity.
Certainly the sex abuse crisis has caused great dislocation, brokenheartedness, and a breach of faith with so many in the pews. How do you restore that? How is that being restored? I know from talking to locals here, they have been elated by some of the most recent appointments by the Holy Fathers. We've got more than one. And you have had a hand in vetting these candidates, shaping and helping the Holy Father with these candidates. Tell us about the importance of that.
Well, you can't underestimate the damage done to the Church by the sex abuse scandals, which profoundly wounded the Church in Ireland. and it leaves a terrible legacy of pain, especially among the victims of sexual abuse. Having said that, I can say with all confidence that the Catholic Church in Ireland has put into place structures, procedures that are second to none in any area of the church or of secular society. That the child protection measures in place in Ireland today in the Catholic Church are second to none. And I have complete confidence in that. I can say also, by way of addition, in parentheses, that the Catholic Church has a national board for the safeguarding of children, which has been run for the last several years under the leadership of an outstanding gentleman named Ian Elliott, who happens to be a Protestant, and it's been his role to watch over, to assess the adherence or the application of the child protection norms in the Catholic Church. So we have complete transparency here on this, choosing someone who's not a Catholic, who comes from a tradition that would have some distance from Catholicism, to be the one watching over that. And he's done a magnificent job. He's just coming to retirement now. With respect to the new bishops, since I've been in Ireland, the Holy Father, the two Holy Fathers that I've served as nuncio in Ireland have appointed, I believe, 5 new bishops. And I think that the Holy Father is both Holy Fathers, but in each case, are looking for men of conviction, of courage, men who will preach the Catholic faith in a compassionate and compelling way in today's society, men who are not afraid to speak to the media, to present the Church's case, to do so with, as I said, with courage and conviction. And I think that's what we need. We need teachers and pastors.
And you have looked at, the Holy Father has selected men who aren't natives to that diocese. Is that by design?
You'd have to ask the Holy Father that question, Raymond. There's a lot to be said for bringing, I think, a bishop into a diocese who does not come from the clergy of that diocese. But to have someone who comes in fresh, who doesn't know the situation so well, allows him to look at the situation with new eyes, without kind of the jaded eyes that someone may have who's been there for a long time. A man also who's not from the diocese probably would not have already made friends with certain of the clergy. He'd be someone who's unknown to many, and it gives everybody a new start. So in general, it depends on the diocese and the needs of the diocese.
Let's talk about this abortion bill that it's making its way through the Irish Parliament. The government says this is not an abortion bill. This is about saving lives for the rare occasion when a woman might be contemplating suicide. And they say anyone with a conscientious objection will not have to perform an abortion.
The Catholic bishops of Ireland have been very clear on this issue. The legislation would permit abortion in a case where a woman was threatening suicide, and it seems that there would be no time restrictions with respect to the gestation of the child if she were threatening suicide. So it is a complicated situation to some degree legally, because there was a Supreme Court decision in Ireland some 20 years ago that set the stage for the current discussion of legislation. But the Catholic bishops of Ireland are convinced and state with great clarity that there's no need for legislation, especially no need for legislation that permits abortion in Ireland.
Let's talk for a moment about the vocational crisis here in Ireland, which seems unfathomable. For those of us who were trained by Irish clergy, Irish nuns, vocational crisis and Ireland don't seem to fit. Yet, in 1990, we had 525 men studying for the priesthood. Today, we have 70. Is there a vocational crisis here?
I mean, indeed there is. There is a vocation crisis, and there's no doubt about that. And it's one of the things that we need to face here in the church in Ireland and to overcome. But I would put it in context by saying 2 things. The first would be that, remember that Ireland, the entire island of Ireland, which is under 2 jurisdictions, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, is geographically and population-wise about the same size as the state of Indiana. Okay? It's about the same population as Indiana and more or less the same size. Now, if Indiana had 500 men studying, that was a figure, 500 men studying.
Yep, 525 men studying for the priesthood.
We would all be totally flabbergasted. Now, the comparison is not completely just because, of course, there are far more Catholics in Ireland than there are in Indiana. The percentage of Catholics is lower than in Indiana. But we have to, I think what we tend to do is we look at a period of church history in Ireland in the first part, especially the first half of the 20th century, the first 3/4 of the 20th century, where we see an amazing amount of vocations to priesthood and religious life. But that was not the case even before that, in the 19th century. It wasn't that high. And so I think, you know, those incredible numbers were something that was very, very beautiful, very, very important for the church throughout the world because of the work these men and women did, but is not necessarily something that will return in our lifetime. We would hope that the numbers will increase, and I think they will.
What's the solution?
The solution, I think, is really two things. Is one, bishops who are unafraid to invite young men to consider a vocation in the priesthood, and to invite their priests to consider inviting young men to the priesthood. You know, traditionally, dioceses didn't have vocation directors. This is a new idea, a recent idea. I might be wrong, but I don't think before Vatican II, many dioceses, if any, had a so-called vocations director. There were as many vocations director in a diocese as there were parish priests. And that needs to be the mentality. Bishops encouraging the priests in the parishes, enthusiastically loving their priesthood, living their priesthood, men of prayer. And if the parish priests are men of prayer and men of conviction, vocations will come. And then we need to, of course, do our very best to make sure that priestly formation in Ireland is strong, healthy, and attractive to the new generation.
How do you get priests to do what Pope Francis has talked about? To go out and get the sheep and come back smelling like the sheep. How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think...
I mean, it's a challenge because these men often, I mean, I know so many, you know these diocesan priests as well. They have very full schedules. They're often living alone in the house. And so they feel, not only do you have the loneliness crushing in on you, but there's all this work to be done. So how do they have the time to then go out and spend quality time with their flock?
I do believe, Raymond, that the most important thing for a priest is to be faithful to a life of prayer. And, you know, sometimes priests say there's a lot of things I have to do. Many things are important. But there are a few things that are absolutely necessary. And if we do the necessary things first, the important things will follow. What I mean is it's you know, when Jesus comes to the house of Martha and Mary sits at his feet, you know, Jesus defends her against Martha, saying she's chosen the one thing necessary. That is the one thing necessary. The one thing necessary is to be at the feet of the Lord, to listen to him, to talk to him in prayer. And if we do that, we will be apostles and we will change things. If we become men, and it's always a temptation for parish priests, it's a temptation for nuncios to be running from one seemingly important thing to another and to neglect the one thing necessary, which is the life of prayer. And if we do that, we will have vocations. I'm certain of that. How
has your view of Ireland changed in your time here?
That's an excellent question, Raymond. I think I came to Ireland, as I said, I'm an Irish American, but I didn't have a lot of contact with Ireland. I had not much contact before I came here as nuncio. So I think that one of the things for me about coming to Ireland is to begin to realize the complexity of the history of Ireland. The layers of history, the parts of history in Ireland that we don't really hear about, especially as Irish Americans. You know, the history of Protestant Irish people. You know, in what is now the Republic of Ireland. You know, it's something that, as a Catholic in America, you never really heard about. You heard about Protestants in the North, but there's a rich history of Protestant Christians in what is now the Republic of Ireland. So the complexity of the history of Ireland, that is something that, that continues to amaze me as I learn more and more about the country.
I want to thank the Archbishop for taking the time to sit with us, as he rarely grants interviews. It was a real treat to speak with him. Now, success in the music industry has often come from unexpected places. My next guest is the producer of the #1 CD on Billboard's current traditional classical chart. It has held that spot for 9 weeks, and this is a CD of a cappella chant by a religious order of nuns in rural Missouri. Angels and Saints at Ephesus and its predecessor, Advent at Ephesus, have outsold artists like Taylor Swift, One Direction. Why are the good sisters experiencing this kind of success, and what's the cultural message here? To discuss is Monica Fitzgibbons, co-founder of De Montfort Music. Monica, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having
me.
Now,
what is happening? You've got people who aren't particularly religious, let's face it. I've seen the comments on Amazon and elsewhere. They're gobbling up this product. Why?
Well, I think that it's very obvious that on just a basic level, they're looking for something much more meditative, much more peaceful, calm, totally different, countercultural. The list goes on, but it is really appealing to, you know, both the faith-based, but yes, the secular.
I want to talk a little bit about your work, your mission to Montfort Music. Let's back up for a moment and talk about these sisters, the Benedictine Sisters of Mary. Where did you find them? You don't live in Missouri. No. How did you hear about these nuns? How did you come across them? And what made you think you could record them with success?
Well, on the supernatural level, I have to say they found us. But they certainly weren't looking for any kind of recording deal. They were just living their life, doing their music for the Lord in their chapel. And they made a little recording for their benefactors who asked them to release something because, you know, they would come and hear their Vespers and things like that. One landed in our lap providentially, and it was just beautiful, and it just never left me. We went, my husband and I, Kevin, who have De Montfort Music, of course, we have this background in the entertainment industry. So when we went and we heard that it was legitimately real, their talent, much more so than even what we'd heard, we said, we have to record this on the highest level and release it.
Wow. I want to play people a clip. This is Mother Cecilia, who's the prioress of the monastery. Listen to this.
With this new CD, which is called Angels and Saints at Ephesus, people will find an album similar in many ways to Advent at Ephesus. It's all of us singing together, again, a cappella, no instruments accompanying us. The title Angels and Saints at Ephesus comes from the fact that we are giving tribute to all the angels and saints. We wanted to do something to honor them. They are such wonderful intercessors for us, wonderful helpers, helping us get to heaven. And many saints have written wonderful prayers, wonderful prose, poetry, and it's often set to music. And they're some of our favorite hymns that we sing after Mass.
Now, you struck a deal with Decca to distribute this. Tell me about that. Why did you go to Decca, this venerable classical house?
Well, we wanted to record the best, and we wanted to put it out on the best, most widely distributed label. They had had that success with the Chant, you know, CD.
Years ago, yeah.
And we just providentially ended up there, and it was, they really took to the idea of it. We laid out the marketing plan. Of course, we'd worked with several of these people before. Both of us, Kevin, my husband, had worked in Sony, and I had worked in Polygram and
you were at DreamWorks later, yeah.
So that was, of course, distributed by Universal. So it was the natural first place to go, and we never looked back. But the funny thing was, the very first recording, of course, we had was Advent at Ephesus last year.
This past Christmas.
Yes, and so we sat down at the, you know, marketing conference table, and I had my whole PowerPoint, and then, you know, the hymn went up, and, you know, so what's Advent? And I was like, okay,
all right,
the computer.
Yeah, start at the beginning.
It was great, though.
Yeah, no, it's a real opportunity, and I mean, these people are genuinely open. They're fascinated by nuns. Nuns are. I just think people are just fascinated by nuns. The life they live. They're out of the world. These sisters are making liturgical vestments, and they have a devotion to the traditional Mass. I mean, it is an amazing group. Let's talk about you for a moment. I read in an interview where you felt that you were living a divided life, a double life, by being in the entertainment industry where you were at DreamWorks, at Polygram, and you had this tingling of faith that you felt put the two worlds in conflict.
Yes. Well, I think on a superficial level, at first, it was that the art was very cookie cutter, similar. You know, it was the same old, and it was getting kind of tiring.
And not terribly redemptive.
Exactly. And then the message on top of it was getting worse and worse. It wasn't as bad when we first started, but it happened quickly in about a decade's time. And so we wanted to put out things that would uplift people. I mean, that's our natural disposition. And of course, we know there's so much in the world right now at this time. You've had quite a few of them on the show tonight. This is something that's positive. This is something that's, you know, the cherry on top for all of our efforts.
And I know you were inspired. You know, I was going to ask you, why did you go down this independent route? Why not let another company, you know, just basically be the middleman and say, okay, here, Sony, here, Decca, you take this over?
Well, because we knew that we wanted to also protect the image and likeness, and we just didn't want it going out and things being manipulated, but also we really wanted them to make money off of this asset. And that is unusual in this day and age for the recording to make money. It's usually relentless touring, you know, merchandising.
And the label makes everything, it's all taken off the top before the artist ever sees a drop of it.
So
what's next?
Well, we have the Dominican Sisters of Mary. I'm sure we all
Mother
know and
Assumpta's
love.
order, which our audience is very familiar with those sisters.
Oh, they're just beautiful. So they've recorded their debut CD, or recording, I should say. That's coming out August 13th. It's called Mater Euchariste, and it's all you know, to Jesus through Mary hymns. But what's really neat about this is that they've written several of these songs. So here you're going to have recorded songs composed by them right next to St. Thomas Aquinas. And they will stand shoulder to shoulder. I mean, this is a beautiful piece of work here.
Wow. And why did you go to Mother Assumpta's group, to the Mary Mother of the Eucharist order?
Well, you know, we had heard their Vespers in one of their missions in Phoenix. That was actually our first exposure to them. And being music people, we were like, we just want to record the Vespers. But they then showed us that they had all this other music in their community that we had no idea. So here's this rich treasure right in our very own backyard. We had to release it.
Yeah. I love that you say the whole approach is we're going to bring something that is beautiful, something that's true, and we're going to bring it in the middle of the culture. We're not going to sort of keep it in the ghetto, which I think is a mistake a lot of people make. And it's a safe place to be in the ghetto because then you don't have to, I mean, you don't have to work very hard in the ghetto. But if you're going to reach that wider audience, it does take an enormous amount of effort.
Well, you know, there's been a lot of blessings along the way, but the whole thing is, if we're going to do it, we have to do it right. So we do bring in top producers, Grammy Award-winning producers, and we want it to be the best it can be.
And are you there through the whole process? You're mixing, you're there listening, you're let's tweak this, move that mic there? I'm not
turning knobs. But in the, you know, in the end, if there's, you know, let's do this a cappella or organ, it's going to be, you know, a cappella here. There's definitely collaboration.
And what's been the reaction? What's most surprised you about the reaction you've gotten from the public?
Well, I think the surprise has been more the secular world who just have heard about it only on NPR or Good Morning America, and they just go clamoring for it. And they don't really know why, but then the results have been, my son has autism and we're playing this around the clock and it's bringing peace to our household that we haven't had, things that we could never have imagined.
And you explain that how?
That's the Holy Spirit. I mean, I can't sit here and say that this was our big master plan. We just liked the music. We wanted to make it available. We thought it was different. And then there's been all these great fruits.
Well, you know, Aaron Neville, who I've interviewed over the years, people say that they, you know, when he sings Ave Maria or the Amazing Grace, they'll play those over and over. And these are people who have no connection at all to faith, but they're drawn to it and they feel something. And when they ask him, he says, well, that's the God in me touching the God in them. And it just, it's different when someone actually believes
Yes.
what they're singing. It does bring something to it that another artist just mouthing the words, they just can't bring that same soul spirit to it, I suppose. So.
Yeah, they're communicating with our Lord, and we're documenting.
Yeah, there's a double level of communication going on, and you hear that in these recordings, which is really spectacular. Monica Fitzgibbons, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you when the new CD comes out. Angels and Saints at Ephesus by the Benedictines of Mary. Queen of Apostles is available at stores everywhere, online, at the usual outlets, iTunes, and of course, through EWTN's religious catalog. Before we go, let's cut to the chase. Well, it was a papal buddy movie of sorts last week, and there are good reasons why Pope Francis and Benedict XVI are presenting a united front. First was the release of the encyclical Light of Faith. Though issued under Pope Francis's name, even he admitted that the work was largely Benedict's. Reading the 90 pages is akin to hearing a duet between Placido Domingo and Neil Diamond. One hits all the proper notes, and the other drives the message home with an approachable everyman sensibility. But the tone of the individual voices is unmistakable. At one moment, we read that to disturb any bit of the faith distorts the whole. Later, we're told that even those doing some good are already on the road to faith, whether they know it or not. And it's an interesting collaboration and worthy reading. But last week's ultimate papal buddy moment, one that happened in the flesh, received almost no coverage. Appearing together for the first time in months, Benedict XVI and Pope Francis met behind St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican Gardens to dedicate a new statue. Now, when I heard this, my antenna instantly went up. 2 popes to dedicate a statue. Turns out it was a statue of St. Michael the Archangel, the traditional angelic defender against evil. And the popes didn't just bless the statue, they consecrated the Vatican to the protection of St. Michael. This is an amazing admission on the part of not one, but 2 popes. As we read of arrests and resignations at the Vatican Bank and of sexual abuse and corruption in the offices of the Holy See, these popes have made a significant joint statement of sorts. Though they have each done their part to improve laws and change procedures at the Holy See, their joint appearance suggests that something more is needed for true reform to take place, a spiritual reform. It also indicates that they believe evil is afoot and in need of binding. Given the many challenges facing Pope Francis inside and outside the Church, perhaps a buddy is needed, and a little divine help from an avenging angel couldn't hurt either. That's all the time we have. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. As always, the Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the website, RaymondArroyo.com. And don't forget to sign up for my weekly e-blasts as well. I also have a new column on my visit to the Charles Dickens House in London and the cultural questions it raised for me. That can be found at RaymondArroyo.com as well. Be sure to watch us next week. At the first stage of the canonization process for the late Vietnamese Cardinal Xavier Van Thuan, as it concludes, we'll bring you an encore presentation of an interview I did with this amazing man a few years ago. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.